right, so Andreas, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with me, and I'd like to ask you a few questions. The first one is, most recently, I heard you talking about the transfer of the teacher-student relationship being the most important determinant of whether or not distance learning can work. Can you talk to U.S. parents and educators a little bit more about that?
Yeah, learning is rarely a transactional experience, where students are consumers and, parents are clients and schools are service providers. Learning is almost always a relational experience where, the subjects in your primary school where you put most effort in were not necessarily those with where you were intrinsically interested in, but there were probably those where, you had a very good relationship with your teacher, where you, felt the passion your teacher had for what they teach, where you felt that your teacher understood you as a person, as a learner. So I do think relationships matter a lot, and particularly in a crisis like this, students who have the motivation to learn on their own, who have the parents, supporting them, who have access to the right learning strategies, they're going to do fine. But students who do not relate to a teacher, who do not have that level of support, who have always been spoon-fed in school, who've never learned to really study on their own, they're going to struggle. So I do think teachers have, keeping up that social fabric in school is perhaps the most important challenge in these days.
So I'd like to follow up on that. Based on the most recent PISA results, it was very interesting. You talked about mindset this time. And something that was fascinating to me, having educated my children in the public schools of Shanghai and in Japan, was this idea of positive mindset. And in China, it seemed that those who were socioeconomically disadvantaged had such a high positive mindset, even compared to those in China who are socioeconomically advantaged. And as we know in the US, those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged have a far lesser positive mindset than those in the US who are socioeconomically advantaged. So based on what you just said about that social transfer between the teacher and the student, can you talk a little bit more about what US educators and parents can do to support that?
Yeah, that growth mindset is not something that we are born with. That is something that is created by the learning environment. For example, where teachers have consistent and high expectations for every learner, no tolerance for failure, where students feel my teacher is not going to downgrade me or make it easier for me when I don't do well, but actually redouble their efforts to help me study, to help me to succeed. That's where we create that kind of growth mindset. One of the most interesting findings from PISA is where school systems are highly stratified. They put learners into boxes depending on their perceived ability. You find that students have a fixed mindset. They basically, start to believe, I'm not that smart, or we belong to that group. But where actually education systems keep the doors open for learners every day, where teachers have this approach to what we call mastery learning, where you keep the ambitions, high, but actually find different pathways for students to reach those ambitions. Those approaches are linked to a positive growth mindset. The growth mindset of young people differs as much as the learning outcomes across countries. You look at top performer Estonia, they're number one on learning outcomes in the OECD area, and they're number one on the student growth mindset. So often those two things go together, but they are a function of our learning environment. The messages that we give to our children every day. Teachers' gender is another variable. What teachers may do is, okay, here's a girl that did really, really well on the math test, so I'm going to give her a super great note, even if the work was good but not great. The message it sends to that girl is basically, oh, well, my teacher really doesn't believe that I'm very smart, but exaggerates the appreciation. So I think the signals that we give to disadvantaged students, learners, is a big factor shaping the mindset with which people grow up. And the growth mindset, later in life may be as important as your academic performance. If you actually do really well in school, but you do not have those self-related beliefs, you're not going to struggle. You're not going to try out to tackle tasks that seem unsurmountable.
So I want to pick up on that. So in the US, we have a funding disparity between taxes and the school districts. And if 2008 is any indication of what we have coming our way in terms of cutting our funding for education, what advice would you give to the US in terms of maybe what other countries are doing as the expert, as literally the world's expert on comparative international education and other school systems? What can the US learn from what other countries to prevent the same kind of funding disparities, or even if we have those funding disparities, maybe where we should reprioritize our spending?
I don't want to say that the United States spends little on education. It actually spends a lot,
Sure.
but I think the US could do a lot better in aligning resources better with the needs. And the investment that we make in education is also a sign of how we value the future. In a way, our schools today is going to be our society tomorrow, our economy tomorrow. And what was very interesting for me to see when China was hit first by this COVID virus, and actually spending on education wasn't cut, even when everything else was cut. Actually, spending on schools was increased, and red tape was eliminated. Schools could suddenly procure devices, material that they needed. They had much more discretion and freedom. In a month, 50 million learners were online. So every kid, receiving tablet and devices. So actually, in a moment of crisis, some countries redouble their effort, to make sure that they create a level playing field, that they keep people on board, that they invest in the social infrastructure. I think this is the moment where we need to invest, not cut back. I think the biggest choice that every individual and every society has to make is the choice between the present and the future. Again, you go to Japan, you go to China, Singapore, those countries, will put their last effort, their last resources in the education of their children. That is the future of their country. In our country, we have already spent the money of our children for our own consumption. Now, that's why we are highly indebted. This is a big signal that, again, we send to teachers that, will be reflected in the value of the status of the teaching profession and the effort parents make to, engage themselves. So I think it's a very, very important part. But it's as much about, how much we spend and how we allocate resources.
How we allocate resources, sure. I'd like to end this on a positive note, if possible. You're obviously very familiar with the US and other education systems. Are there some unique strengths that the US may have that we can capitalize on that will help our next generation?
Yeah, many of the really most innovative ideas in education that are being deployed around the world actually come from the United States. The United States may not have been so good in spreading and scaling good practice, but it's certainly very good at inventing it. And I think this crisis will help, the spread of good ideas. It will sort of, in a way, liberate some of the practices, the use of, technology, the most creative teachers. So I think actually this is a moment where, hopefully the best and most innovative practices will get more play.
Well, I appreciate your time, and I support your continued good efforts and positive work. And I look forward to staying in touch, Andreas.
Thanks so much, Teru.